In a small town, a racist attack on an innocent black woman ignites a dangerous series of events. When her brother's life is taken by corrupt officers, his sister, a quiet, unassuming woman, is about to embark on a journey that will shake the very foundations of the corrupt system. But they had no idea. She's not just any woman. She's a trained military fighter, and the justice she's about to deliver is something they never saw coming. Before we dive into this incredible journey, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more jaw-dropping stories. The sun was beginning to set on the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. A gentle breeze stirred the trees, but there was no peace in the air. A commotion had broken out, and it wasn't just the usual noise from the neighbors. This time, it was different. This time, there was blood. Tasha Williams, a 24-year-old college student, was on her way home after a late-night study session when she noticed something strange. A black SUV had pulled up beside her as she walked down the street. The tinted windows made it impossible to see the faces of the men inside, but she could hear the muffled voices that sounded all too familiar. They were men from the neighborhood, racist thugs with reputations for violence and intimidation, who never hesitated to make their targets feel the sting of their hatred. Tasha didn't know them personally, but she had heard the stories of how they terrorized anyone who didn't look like them. Black men and women who had no choice but to keep their heads down to avoid conflict. But Tasha, unlike others, was not the type to hide. As she walked, the SUV pulled to a stop in front of her. The door swung open, and two large men stepped out. They were dressed in dirty clothes, their faces concealed by baseball caps, and they had the look of men with nothing to lose. But tonight, they had picked the wrong target. Tasha paused, knowing exactly what was about to happen. It was the same old intimidation routine they always pulled. They would call her a name, make her feel small, maybe shove her around a little bit. But this time, Tasha was ready. She wasn't afraid anymore. She stood tall and looked them in the eye. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice firm. One of the men sneered, stepping forward with a cruel grin. "You don't belong here, girl," he spat, pulling something from his pocket. It was a gun, black and shiny, a symbol of their power over those they saw as lesser. The other man stepped back, arms crossed, watching with a twisted look of amusement. "Get on your knees," the first man ordered, his voice dripping with venom. But Tasha didn't budge. She wasn't going to kneel for anyone, not for these racist thugs. Her heart raced, but she held her ground. Her mind raced, calculating every possibility. How could she get out of this? How could she protect herself? The man raised the gun, aiming it straight at her. But before he could pull the trigger, something changed in the air. The sound of sirens filled the distance, and the sound was getting closer. But these weren't just any sirens. These were the sirens of authority, of justice. This was no longer just Tasha against two thugs. This was the moment she had been waiting for. From around the corner of the street, a police car screeched to a halt. The two men froze, their expressions turning from cocky to uncertain. But just as quickly as they were shocked, they turned their aggression back on the woman, aiming the gun once more. "Don't move," the thug with the gun yelled, his finger trembling on the trigger. But just as he was about to pull it, a figure emerged from behind the police car. A tall man, dressed in a dark jacket, his eyes hidden behind a pair of sunglasses, stepped into the street. His movements were calculated and deliberate. He surveyed the situation in seconds, analyzing the dynamics. And then, in a flash, he was on the thugs. One of the officers with him shouted at the thugs, "Drop your weapons." But the thug with the gun didn't listen. He pointed it at the newcomer with a growl, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he dove forward, tackling the thug to the ground in one swift motion. A muffled shot rang out, but it missed. The gun flew out of the thug's hand, and the man in the jacket held him down effortlessly. The other thug, seeing his friend's defeat, hesitated for a moment. That hesitation was enough. The officer at the scene made his move, pulling out his own weapon and forcing the thug to surrender. Tasha stood there, wide-eyed, watching the scene unfold. She hadn't expected this kind of intervention. But as the officer handcuffed the thugs and led them away, she couldn't help but feel the rush of adrenaline. She had survived. However, this wasn't just any ordinary officer. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As the officers walked away with the two men, the man who had intervened approached her. He was tall, his jaw set in determination, and his eyes held a hardened look like someone who had seen too much violence in his time. His uniform wasn't a standard police issue. Instead, it was more tactical, and he carried himself with an aura of authority that made the officers respect him. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm but urgent. His eyes scanned her face for any sign of injury. Tasha was still in shock, but she nodded. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her heart was still pounding. The man nodded once, his expression unreadable. "You were lucky. They weren't expecting me." Tasha blinked, confused. "Who are you?" she asked, looking up at him. Before he could respond, another officer walked over, pulling him aside. The conversation was brief, but it was clear from the officer's tone that this man wasn't just a regular cop. Something about him was different. Something about his presence made Tasha feel like there was more to him than he let on. The officer nodded toward Tasha, then turned to leave, his back straight and his movements precise. The officer who had been with the man walked past her, giving her a small nod before disappearing behind the door of the police car. Tasha, still handcuffed and shaken, had no idea what was happening. She was grateful for the intervention, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. She looked at the officer in tactical gear one last time, wondering who he really was. As the ambulance arrived and paramedics began tending to the thug who had been knocked out, Tasha found herself surrounded by more police officers. They had their hands full with the two men who had tried to harm her. But there was one lingering thought in Tasha's mind that she couldn't shake. Who was the man who had just intervened, and why had he been so quick to act? The officers around her spoke to one another, coordinating their efforts to secure the scene, but Tasha's eyes remained fixed on the man in tactical gear. He was still standing near the squad car, but now he was engaged in conversation with one of the senior officers. His posture was authoritative, like someone who wasn't just here to observe. He belonged to this world of tactical operations, but this wasn't his usual beat. Tasha took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, but she couldn't let the moment slip away without getting answers. She had to know who he was, why he had stepped in, and most importantly, what he had meant when he said they weren't expecting me. As if reading her thoughts, the man turned and began walking toward her. His footsteps were steady and deliberate, cutting through the noise of the station. The air around him felt charged, and Tasha's heart skipped a beat as he approached. She didn't know why, but something about him felt familiar, almost predatory. "You handled yourself well back there," he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of experience. Tasha was taken aback by his calm demeanor, especially after such a tense situation. "I know that must have been hard." Tasha wasn't sure how to respond. The situation had been so fast, so chaotic, but she managed a stiff nod. "I had no choice. They were going to hurt me." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't looking at her with pity or sympathy, but something deeper, as if he were sizing her up. "You're right," he said, his tone unwavering. "You didn't, and that's the thing." He paused, then added, "You did exactly what needed to be done, the right thing." Tasha glanced over at the officers, who were busy dealing with the two men, now being loaded into the police car. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "You just helped me." "Why?" The man hesitated for a moment, glancing around to make sure no one was overhearing. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "Because people like them, the ones who pull the trigger and walk away, don't get to keep winning. They have to be stopped, and I'm someone who knows how to stop them." A chill ran through Tasha. "What does that mean?" "I'm not just a cop, miss," he said, stepping back slightly and looking at the ground. "I'm a former military fighter, trained for situations just like this one. But it's not just about taking down thugs, it's about making sure the right people are held accountable. The ones behind the scenes, the ones who think they're untouchable." Tasha's breath caught in her throat. The way he spoke was intense, like someone who had lived through horrors beyond what most people could understand. And for the first time she realized something about him. This wasn't just some random cop doing his job. This man had been through the fire, and now he was here, in the middle of Riverton, ready to wage war on the corrupt system that had caused so much pain. The FBI had been involved, but now she saw that this man was part of something even more powerful than the law. Something personal. "Who are you?" Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to know. The man paused, his expression hardening. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been watching the situation here for a long time. This isn't the first time people like those men have hurt someone who didn't deserve it. It's time for justice, real justice." Tasha's thoughts swirled. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This was a level of complexity she couldn't have anticipated. She was dealing with corruption that ran deep, far beyond a simple street altercation. What had started as a random attack on her was quickly turning into something much bigger, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, still trying to wrap her mind around what was happening. "Why tell me now?" He smiled slightly, but the look in his eyes remained cold. "Because, Miss Walker, you're part of this now. Whether you like it or not, you've been dragged into something much larger than you think, and I'm the one who's going to make sure you don't get crushed by it." Tasha's eyes widened as the weight of his words settled in. The situation had gone from a personal attack to a fight for survival. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for the truth to come out, for those in power to be exposed. She was fighting for justice, her own and everyone else's who had been wronged. "So what happens next?" she asked, looking up at him with resolve. "We go after them." The man's voice was firm. "And we take them all down." The next few days were a blur of planning, strategizing, and trying to keep herself together. Briana's life had just shifted gears from a quiet existence to one of intense danger. The man who had stepped in to save her, the one who called himself Marcus Black, a former military fighter, wasn't just an ally. He was now her partner in a battle she never expected to be a part of. He had been watching the corruption in Riverton for years, waiting for the right moment to strike, and now that moment had arrived. Briana couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a war zone, but Marcus made it clear that they were in this together. The details he had shared with her about the network of corrupt officers and high-profile politicians involved in the underground world of human trafficking, money laundering, and systemic racism were chilling. Briana, like many others in her community, had been blissfully unaware of how deep the rot went until now. The first step in their plan was to gather more intel. Marcus had access to a network of former military contacts, each one well-versed in gathering surveillance and tracking sensitive information. With his help, Briana set up a covert operation to track down the officers involved in her wrongful arrest and those who had been behind the scheme to silence her family. Marcus was a specialist in black ops, and his skills had saved countless lives in unstable regions around the world. Now they were about to put them to work in Riverton. For the next few days, Briana worked in the shadows, moving through her daily life while trying to stay off the radar. She continued to teach at the high school, though her focus was entirely on taking down the corrupt system that had cost her brother his life. Meanwhile, Marcus used his network to get closer to the heart of the syndicate that had planted Sloan and the other corrupt officers into the system. They needed evidence, hard evidence that could take them down. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. Briana knew they were running out of time. The officers who had once been untouchable now had their backs against the wall. Sloan had been arrested, but there were still plenty of people behind the scenes who were pulling strings. Briana could feel it in her gut. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that someone was watching them. They had made enemies, and their every move was being tracked. One evening, as Briana sat in the quiet of her apartment going over the notes she had compiled, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. He had been infiltrating the network, and his message was short but urgent. "Meet me at the old warehouse near the docks, now." Her heart skipped a beat. Briana knew the warehouse well. It had once been a storage facility for old goods and materials, but recently, it had become the site of questionable activities. This wasn't just a random meeting place. This was where the real power behind the corruption operated. Briana grabbed her coat and left the apartment without hesitation. She couldn't afford to waste time. As she drove to the warehouse, her thoughts raced. Was this a trap? Had they been discovered? Every instinct told her to be careful, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. Too much was at stake. The warehouse loomed in front of her, its dark, empty windows casting an ominous shadow. Briana parked her car in the lot, checking her rearview mirror to make sure she wasn't being followed. There was no sign of Marcus's car. The only movement was a distant flicker of light near the back entrance. She stepped out of her car, nervous but resolute. This was the moment. The truth would finally come out, and she would get the justice her brother deserved. As she walked toward the entrance, the sounds of footsteps echoed behind her. Briana spun around, ready for whatever danger lay ahead. To her relief, it was Marcus, his dark silhouette appearing from the shadows. "You made it," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have much time." "What's going on?" Briana asked, her heart racing. "Why here?" Marcus motioned for her to follow him. "The source I've been working with has some new intel. We're about to blow the whole thing wide open, but we need to act fast. The people we're up against won't hesitate to destroy everything we've worked for." Briana nodded, her pulse quickening. The air felt thick with tension, the weight of everything they had uncovered hanging over them like a storm cloud. As they approached the entrance to the warehouse, Marcus pulled out a flashlight and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. "Stay close," Marcus said as they entered the building. The silence of the space seemed oppressive, like a forgotten tomb. Briana could hear the faint hum of something in the distance, but she couldn't place it. There was an eerie, unsettling feeling in the air, as if something was waiting to pounce. They made their way to a back room at the far end of the warehouse. Inside, there was a large table stacked with papers, blueprints, and maps. Marcus pointed to the wall, where a detailed map of the town was pinned up. It had been marked with various locations, addresses, meeting spots, and hidden safe houses. "This is it, Briana," Marcus said, his voice tight. "We've got everything we need to take them down, but we have to move quickly. We've only got a small window before they realize we're onto them." Briana stood silently, her gaze locked on the map. Everything had led to this moment. Her heart pounded in her chest as she absorbed the enormity of what was at stake. They had the power to change everything, to take down the corrupt officers and politicians who had been using their power to destroy lives. But the danger was real. They had enemies, and they wouldn't stop until Briana and Marcus were silenced. "We do this now," Marcus said, determination in his eyes. "It's time to finish this." The clock was ticking, and the plan was set into motion. Briana felt the weight of everything she had been through crashing down on her, as she and Marcus prepped for what they both knew was going to be the most dangerous part of their mission. The map on the table was their blueprint, a guide to unraveling the web of corruption. But it wasn't just any map. It was their last chance to take down the system that had torn her family apart. They had worked quickly over the past few days. Marcus had used his military contacts to obtain high-level intel. They had the names of key players, the officers, the politicians, and the business tycoons who were complicit in the illegal activities. The evidence was solid, but it was still up to them to bring it all to light. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about revenge and justice. The plan was risky. Briana knew it would be a fight, and she wasn't naive enough to think they wouldn't encounter resistance. But the tactical advantage they had was the element of surprise. The enemy thought they were untouchable. They had corrupted the system for years, and now they were about to face the consequences of their actions. The first target was the mayor's office. Marcus had learned that the mayor, Douglas Hargrove, was in on the corruption, using his influence to cover up the criminal activities of the police force and high-profile businessmen in the town. Hargrove was the mastermind behind the entire operation, and if they wanted to bring the whole network down, he had to be taken down first. Marcus had devised a plan to infiltrate the mayor's office undetected. He and Briana would pose as part of the FBI task force, using a combination of false identification and the intel they had gathered. They would be able to get inside, plant the evidence, and expose the network once and for all. Briana was nervous. She was no military fighter like Marcus, and the thought of facing these dangerous men was daunting. But she knew that this was the only way to get her brother's revenge and the justice she had been fighting for. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The plan was set. They would move in at midnight, when the office was least guarded, but Marcus wasn't taking any chances. They had everything prepared, including silent tools for breaking into secure locations and coded messages that would allow them to bypass the complex security systems in place. Briana wasn't entirely comfortable with the level of tactics involved, but Marcus had trained for this moment. He had fought wars. He knew how to take down enemies who thought they were invincible. As they drove toward the mayor's office, Briana's thoughts kept returning to the anger and hurt she had carried for so long. Her brother's death, her wrongful arrest, everything had led to this moment. She thought about the police officers who had killed him, about the people who had conspired to cover it all up. Jamal's face flashed in her mind, and the grief of losing him swelled up once more. Marcus noticed the change in her demeanor. He reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're doing this for him, Briana. You're not in this alone." His words felt like a lifeline, but they also reminded her of the high stakes. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had been wronged. She wasn't going to let her brother's legacy fade into the shadows. This was her fight, and she was going to win it. They arrived at the mayor's office building, a towering structure in the heart of Riverton. The building was dark, but there were faint lights flickering through the windows, signaling that some staff members were still inside. Briana could feel the tension building. Marcus looked over at her and gave a slight nod. It was time. They approached the side entrance of the building, where Marcus used a specialized tool to disable the security system. Within moments they were inside. Briana's heart pounded as they moved through the dark hallways, the only sound being their footsteps and the distant hum of the city. They reached the mayor's office door and Marcus swiftly unlocked it. The door creaked open, and the dim light from the streetlights outside illuminated a large desk piled with documents, some of them, Briana was sure, containing the evidence they needed. But they didn't have time to waste. They had one shot at this. Marcus quickly started rifling through the drawers of the desk, while Briana stood watch near the door. The seconds felt like hours. Each passing moment brought more risk, more danger. The air in the room was thick with tension. "Got it," Marcus whispered, pulling out a file marked with classified stamps. He scanned the contents, his face hardening as he read. "This is it. This is everything we need to bring down the whole damn system. Briana's eyes widened as she read over his shoulder. There it was. Names, dates, meetings, and the proof of a massive criminal syndicate involving the mayor, the police, and the business elites. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. It was all right there, laid out before them like a map to destruction. Before they could leave, however, Briana heard footsteps approaching. The tension in the room was immediate. They weren't supposed to be discovered yet. The plan had been for them to leave without anyone knowing they were there. "We need to move now," Marcus hissed, grabbing Briana's arm. They quickly stuffed the files into a bag, and Marcus motioned for her to follow him out of the room. But just as they reached the hallway, the door at the end of the corridor swung open. Briana's breath caught in her throat as she saw the figure standing at the far end of the corridor. The lights from the hallway flickered overhead, casting shadows on the floor, and for a moment it felt like the world had slowed down. It was Officer Sloan, the man who had ordered her brother's death. The same officer who had framed her and tried to silence the truth. He was here, standing in front of her, just as the tension in the air reached a breaking point. "I knew it was you two," Sloan sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I knew you would come after me eventually." Briana's heart raced, but her resolve only grew stronger. She wasn't backing down now, not when they were so close to exposing everything, not when she was this close to getting her revenge. "What do you think you're going to do?" Sloan continued, taking slow, deliberate steps toward them. "You think you can bring me down with some petty evidence? You're not even from this world. You're out of your league, Briana." Marcus moved into position, standing slightly in front of Briana, his eyes locked on Sloan. "You don't know who you're messing with, Sloan." Marcus's voice was low but deadly. "You're already done. It's just a matter of time before we take you down." Sloan's expression twisted with rage, and Briana could see the desperation in his eyes. The room seemed to close in around them. He pulled a gun from under his jacket, pointing it straight at them. "You should have stayed away, Marcus. And you," he said, turning his gaze to Briana, "you should have known better than to come for me. You won't get away with this. I'll make sure of it." Briana's pulse quickened, but her body remained calm. This was it, the moment where everything could go horribly wrong. They had to act fast. The entire fate of the operation rested on this final standoff. "You won't make it out of here alive, Sloan," Briana said, her voice colder than she ever thought it could be. "Not this time." The tension in the room was thick. Sloan's hand tightened around the grip of his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. Briana could hear her heartbeat in her ears, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound in the room. Everything felt suspended in time. Then, without warning, Marcus lunged forward. It was a blur of motion, faster than the human eye could follow. Sloan had no time to react as Marcus grabbed his wrist, twisting it with a bone-crushing force that sent the gun skittering across the floor. The next thing Briana knew, Marcus had Sloan on the ground, his knee pressed against the officer's chest, rendering him completely immobilized. Sloan struggled beneath Marcus, but it was futile. He was outmatched. Marcus's hands were steady and unyielding, holding Sloan in place while Briana moved forward, eyes never leaving the man who had caused her so much pain. "This is for my brother, Sloan." Briana's voice was calm, but the fire behind her words burned through every syllable. Sloan's eyes widened in fear. "You think you've won? You think you can just triefing?" Before he could finish, Marcus's fist landed on his face, knocking the officer unconscious. He had no time to waste on words. They had bigger plans. Marcus stood up, breathing heavily. "He's out for now. Let's move." Briana grabbed the bag of evidence, her hands still trembling. They needed to get out of the building. They couldn't afford to get caught now, not when they were so close. Sloan was done, but the network still had to be exposed. They moved quickly, down the back hallway and toward the emergency exit. Briana's mind was spinning, her heart still pounding, but the adrenaline pushed her forward. They were so close to the finish line. As they reached the exit, Briana heard the faint sound of sirens approaching. It was a race against time. The FBI had been watching the situation closely, but things were happening faster than they had anticipated. If they didn't get the evidence to the right people now, it could all fall apart. Marcus looked at Briana. "Get to the car. I'll cover you." Without another word, Briana ran to the waiting car, her feet pounding on the ground as she pushed through the door and slid into the driver's seat. Her hands shook as she started the engine. She couldn't afford to hesitate now. They had the evidence. The fight was nearly over. As she drove away from the scene, she glanced back one last time. The mayor's office, once a symbol of power and corruption, was now just another part of her journey toward justice. The fight was far from over, but Briana felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The FBI would take care of the rest. The pieces were falling into place, and Sloan, along with the network of people he had worked for, was about to face the consequences of their actions. But there was one thing Briana couldn't shake: who had helped them. She still didn't know who had tipped off the FBI. Was it someone inside the department? Or had someone else been watching them from the shadows? The answers were still out there, but one thing was certain: Briana Walker's fight for justice was just beginning.